I'm Bob Dunlap, and welcome to the course on AR-15 triggers. AR-15 is a relatively easy gun to do a trigger job on, and the system is similar to many other guns, including the AK-47 and the Daewoo and several other assault rifles and several other sporting rifles. So when you learn this trigger, you'll be able to do others that are similar also. And you may want to get a tape on that particular one just to get the fine points, but the basics are the same. Before we actually start to do the trigger job on this AR-15, I want to go over some physics with you, shall we say, or some laws that you need to obey. You need to understand some basic principles of safe sear engagement angles or surfaces or engagements, if you will want to call it that. So we'll start off by showing you good, bad, and ugly in a demonstration that we have made. Now, some of you know I used to teach firearm repair full-time, and in my classes I'd lecture for a while for one day, and then the next time the class met I'd ask questions about what we lectured on, and if they hadn't done their homework and couldn't answer the questions, then I got mad and I made them all do nasty things that took a lot of time, but would teach them for sure the principle of what I discussed the time before. Over the first one first, that's the neutral one. On a neutral trigger system, basically the angle of the full cock notch and the angle of the trigger is exactly the same as the angle that the trigger sear arches through as you pull the trigger, so that the hammer neither moves back or forward as you pull the trigger, but sits still and then is released. This is what we call neutral. In other words, it doesn't want to cam itself out of engagement, nor does it want to cam itself into engagement. This type of system is only acceptable on a 2 or 3 sear system, not on any conventional systems at all. The next one is the negative system. On this one, the angle of the trigger or the angle of the full cock notch of the hammer is such that it is greater than 90 degrees or perpendicular to the arch of the trigger. And as you pull the trigger, the hammer will start to creep forward until it's finally released by the trigger and falls. This is negative. This is strictly verboten. You cannot have this in any trigger system. I should say, this cannot be on the let-off sear, the final sear of any trigger system. The disadvantage to it is that it is unsafe and may in fact fire. If you drop the gun or bump the hammer, it will very likely fall and could fire. Another disadvantage to it is that it makes the trigger feel creepy. So we have it cocked and we pull the trigger. If you'll notice the angle of the top of the trigger, it changes, doesn't it? And it actually becomes less negative. Watch it as it's pulled. You see, it becomes less negative.
Are you enjoying what you're learning? Then subscribe to the American Gunsmithing Institute's channel right now.
So that as the trigger is pulled, the cam action of the hammer against the trigger and the spring in the trigger decreases because the angle of the amount of negativeness changes. It becomes less, and so the hammer loses its power to overpower, the ability to overpower the trigger spring. So let's say that we have a 2-pound cam arrangement. In other words, the hammer has enough force and the angle is great enough that it's trying to push the trigger out of engagement by 2-pound force. We have a 4-pound spring pulling it in, pushing it in. When we add 2 pounds to the trigger starts to move. But as we continue to pull the trigger and the trigger moves and it becomes less negative, it no longer exerts a 2-pound force trying to cam it out of engagement. It's 1.5 pounds. So the weight of the trigger goes up as the trigger is pulled. So we start off at 3.5 and end at 4-pound trigger pull. It makes the creep feel greater than it is, or you feel every bit of it. Now on the positive system, it is just the opposite. On that one, the angle of the hammer and trigger in relation to the trigger's pivot arch is less than 90. So as the trigger pivots out of engagement with the hammer is forced to move back. Now watch it move as I pull the trigger. See it coming back? That's what you want. Now that's more, of course, than you want. That's very positive. But you want it to move back a few thousandths of an inch when the trigger is pulled. Now, on this last trigger mechanism that we have showing here, we have a trigger job. Now, if you look at the number 3, the positive one, and look at the engagement of the sear to the full cock notch, and these notches are about the same thickness or depth. And then go to number 4, notice that the sear has been reshaped. Basically, the back of it has been cut off, so that the front of it's been cut off slightly. The angle has been changed at the top, so that the back of the trigger hits the hammer notch back there and limits how far in it can go. And so the front has less engagement than it does before it's unaltered. When it's unaltered. When I pull the trigger on this one, then we have almost no trigger movement before it goes, compared to this one unaltered. Great deal of trigger travel before the hammer falls, compared to this one has very little trigger travel before the hammer falls. Now, because this is made of wood, it's not perfect, and you get some flexing, but I think you get the idea. Now, if you don't understand this positive, negative, neutral, and why, review this part of the tape over until you do understand it. This is very important. These rules are not to be broken. It must be positive. Simply has to be positive. You can't have a negative, and you should not have a neutral.
Do you want to learn the complete design, function, and repair of all different types of firearms and become a certified professional gunsmith? If so, go to www.americangunsmithinginstitute.com and request a complete information package.